Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome to part 2 of this tutorial in which we're looking at creating this cosmic energy orb thing in Motion 5. So let's get started on part 2. If you remember, we ended up with something that looked a bit like this. We've got various groups with various different components in, and I want to render them out as elements so that I can do some further compositing before we get on to the main scene. The first thing I want to do is I want to turn off the core, and then I want to come into the refraction group, and at the top of it we've got two lens flares, and so I'm going to make a new group at the top here and call it flares, and then I'm going to grab those two, command clicking them to select them both, and I'm going to drag them into that new flares group. Just want to make sure that the mask group again is at the top of the stack, so that's shift command backward square bracket, and then those flares get masked by the mask group. And let's turn those flares off, and now we've got this sort of base layer without the flares, and I want to render this out. So let's come to the Share menu, Export Movie. I'm going to select ProRes 444, hit Next. I've made a new folder called Tutorial Renders, and I'm going to call this Energy Orb Base, and we'll save that. And that'll take a minute or so to do, so we'll come back when that's done. Next, let's turn off everything in those bottom four groups and turn on core, and then again we'll come to Share, Export Movie, 444, let's call it Energy Orb Stage Core. Save that out and come back in a second. Next, let's turn off core and we'll turn on flares. Again we'll come to the Share menu and we'll come down to Save Current Frame this time, because we just want a still of this. So I select that, and we're going to select Ping or PNG and say Next, and we'll call it Stage Flares. Save that out, turn that off, turn on Refraction, again come back to the Share menu, again come to Save Current Frame, still keep it on Ping, Next, and we'll call this Refraction. Okay, so those are those elements rendered out. I'm going to now make a new comp. Okay, so I've made a new project, and if we come over here we'll see that it's 1920 1080, it's 24 frames a second, and it's 10 seconds long. Come back to my file browser. I've navigated to my tutorial renders folder where we rendered those elements to, and I'm going to just drag them into the project group. Now we need to move base down to the bottom, so that's shift command forward square bracket, and we need to change the blending mode of some of these. So select core, F1 for its blend mode, set that to add. Same with the flares, set that to add, and the refraction we're going to turn off. So now we've got something that resembles what we had before. So first of all I'm going to move core out into a new group, and I'm going to do the same with flares, move into a group of its own, and we'll just tidy this up by naming them. Okay, and we'll call this base group base. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do something with this refraction layer that we created, and actually start to make this look a little bit more like a refraction rather than just this overlay that we had before. So my first step is going to be to duplicate this base layer, so that's Command D. And then I'm going to make an image mask for that new layer, so that's Shift Command M. And I'm going to take that refraction and I'm going to drag it into the image mask source well. And down here where it says source channel, I'm going to set that to luminance. So we're not really seeing anything just yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this new layer, F1 for its transform, and I'm just going to rotate it through about 20 degrees. And again, we're not seeing anything because I need to adjust this refraction layer. So it's giving me a little bit more of a solid matte. So I'm going to come to the library, Command 2, come to Filters, come to Color Correction and Levels. And I'm going to drag that onto that refraction layer. Notice that that is still turned off. That's fine. It's still influencing that image mask. So let's hit F3. And we want to crunch in the blacks a bit, but mainly what we want to do is bring these whites right down. So we've got something like that. And so if I turn that on, you can see that's much more crunchy. And now if we turn off this masked layer, you can see this twisted around version is now being composited on the top. So it's looking like that's being refracted through the glass, because what happens with a refraction is that the light gets bent and we don't see directly through. So I think when that's on the run, it's going to make a just slightly more glassy look. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that same layer and I'm going to duplicate it. Command D, F1 for its transform here, and I'm going to set its blend mode to screen. Then that's just given me a slightly more punchy version of that. Looks a bit brighter, more glassy. So that's our base layer composited, and our core we can do something a bit more with as well. So I'm going to come to this core group. I'll select the core layer and duplicate it, so that's Command D. F1 for its properties. Let's scale it down to 75%, move it up on Y, and give it a bit of rotation. And then what I wanted to do is have a little bit of flicker. So I'm going to come to its opacity here, right click on that, add parameter behavior, wriggle. I'm going to set the amount to 75 and the apply mode to subtract, and then let's have a look how that plays. I think you can see that that's now flickering quite organically at the top there. We maybe increase the noisiness to about 0.7. So now let's duplicate that layer, Command D, F1 for its transform. Let's set the scale to 50%. This time let's bring it down somewhere like that. Again, rotate it so to make sure we've got a different bit, something like that. F2 for its wriggle here, and let's click on the random seed and possibly also just have a wriggle offset value of about 50 or something. And now those two are flickering independently and giving us something really quite lively and interesting. One more thing I want to do, which is to come to the base core layer, Command 2 for the library, Filters, Color Correction, and I want to grab a Levels again, apply that, F3 for the inspector, and I just want to bring the black level in a bit, just crunch that in and make it a little bit more contrasty and increases the drama of those flickering elements. Okay, so apologies for having taken extra time to finesse this orb element, but I think you can see that that's really helped to improve it quite a bit. So anyway, let's push ahead and render out these new elements. First of all, I'm going to turn off flares and core, and we'll render out the base again. So I'll hit Command E, and that brings up the export movie window. Make sure it's selected to ProRes 444, hit next, and make sure not to overwrite my original base, and I'm going to call this base 2, and I'll render that out. Then I'm going to turn off base, and I'm going to turn on core, and again I'll hit Command E, again ProRes 444, next, and I'll call it core 2, and we'll save that out. There's no need to save out these flares again because we're going to use them just as they are from the first effort. So now we can close this project and make a new one. So I've made a new project, and again it's 1920 1080, 24 frames a second, 10 seconds long, just like my other two. And I'm going to come over to the file browser and I'm going to grab those two elements I've just made, so core 2 and base 2, and I'm also going to select that flares element, bring those all in to that group. Just going to do one thing before we start, and that's to make a new group. Command-Shift-N, come to the library, Command-2, come to generators, and look for color solid, bring that into that group, F4 for the controls, change that color to black, call this group black, and move it to the back of everything. That's Command-Shift-4 and let's lock it so that remains a nice black background we can composite against. Next, to drive you completely crazy, I'm going to recomposite these orb elements yet again. So I'm going to take flares and base, and I'm going to hit Shift-Command-G to make a group out of them, and I'll call that outer. And I'll select Core 2, Shift-Command-G, call that inner. Hit F1 for its blend mode. I'm going to set that to add. Similarly, I'm going to select the outer and set its blend mode also to add. Next, I want to select flare and also set its blend mode to add. Then I'm going to come to the library, Command-2, select filters, color correction, levels, and I'm going to apply it to that flare element at the top there. F3 for the inspector. And what I'm going to do is just increase the gamma here in the middle. Just punch that up to about there, and then I'm going to duplicate this flares layer, so Command-D. And what that's doing is just punching up those flares so they really cut through and look strong and dramatic. Then I'm going to make a new group, Command-Shift-N, still in this enclosing group here, and I'm going to call it Raise. And I'm going to grab that base 2 and Alt drag it into the Raise group. And then I'm just going to move that Raise group to the back of this main group. That's Shift-Command-Square-Bracket. And then I want to come to the library, Command-2, Filters, Blur, and I'm going to select Zoom Blur and apply it to that base layer inside the raise there. F3 for the inspector, and we'll set a raise amount of 15. And then we want to hit F1 to come to its transform, and here under scale we're going to set that to 200. And you see what that's given me is this big sort of corona of activity here. Let's also create a mask, so that's Alt-C, and holding down Shift and Alt will drag out from the center here just to mask off the middle. And then we'll come over here, hit the reset button just to center it up, and F4 for the mask controls. We'll give ourselves a feather of about 75. And we'll hit invert. And F1 maybe for its scale, and just increase that a bit so it's not encroaching too much onto the foreground. So let me take this top group here and I'll call that orb, and then I want to adjust the positions of the various elements in Z space. So I'm going to select outer, come over to its Z position here and set a value of 250. Then I'll select inner and I'll type a value of -250 on Z. And finally I'll select the raise and we'll have a value of -500 on Z. And the point of all that is to establish some parallax between these different elements as we switch to 3D. So the core will appear to be behind the main outside area of the orb. I want now just to come to 5 seconds on the timeline, so type in 5 down there, and with the raise selected I'm going to hit O on the keyboard, and that will crop the raise to end at that point. Command-2 for the library, behaviors, basic motion, I will add a fade in, fade out, add that to the raise there. F2 for its controls, fade in time I'll set to 0, fade out time I'll set to 12, and that's because we just want the raise to fade off once everything has landed, and that'll be at 5 seconds. And just one final tweak before we move on. In moving that inner element back, I needed also to scale it, so let's hit F1 for its transform, and let's set a scale of 113. And that just brings it back up to its original size. And now we can move on and construct the fly-through component. So let's close up these two groups, tidy everything up, and our next step is to make a camera, so that's Alt-Command-C, and we'll switch everything to 3D. notice that our black group, because we've locked it, stays 2D, which is exactly what we want. Next we want to animate our camera, but first of all we need to set up its camera controls here, and I'm going to set the near plane to 1 and the far plane to 50,000, so it's 50,000, and then the fades to 0 as well. That's because the default far plane is set at 10,000 and we're going to be moving quite a long way, and I don't want anything to sort of start disappearing. Okay, so let's hit F1 for the camera properties, and let's come to 5 seconds on the timeline. I want to click on the Y and Z positions, and I want to open up the rotation and also click on the Z rotation. I'm going to set a Y position of -400 and a Z position of 2200, 22000. So then let's come back to our first frame and let's change these values. I'm going to set a Z position of -3250 and a Z rotation of -25. Next I'm going to come to 3 seconds, and that Y position I'm going to set to 0. What's wrong about it at the moment is that the orb is in the wrong place. So let's come to the orb group and set the Z position to 6000, 6000, and we also need to adjust the scale to 500%. And if we play that, nothing, and then we fly back till we get to that final position. So we want to come back and adjust those camera keyframes in the Keyframe Editor. So I'll hit Command 8 to open up the Keyframe Editor. And you'll see we've got a load of controls that we don't want to see. So what I'm going to do is come to here to this menu which says All, and I'm going to select Animated. And that just narrows it down to the animated parameters for the camera, which are the only ones we want to look at. Now the one I want to tweak is the Z position, so I'm going to Alt click on Transform Position Z over here, and that'll solo those keyframes. Okay, so let's come to 3 seconds on the timeline, typing 3 seconds in that timecode window there, and what I'm going to do is set a new keyframe for this Z position here by clicking on that button there. And then I'm going to type in this field just to the left of it, and I want a value of 4450. And then I want to adjust the Bezier handles on either side. So I'm going to open that up a bit just so we get a better view of it. So I'm going to select the first Bezier handle, and I just want to drag it down till it's below the curve, just below the curve, not too much. Don't want to flatten it off too much. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with the other one. Just drag it just below the curve, like so. So now we've got a nice smooth curve going all the way through with that keyframe in the middle. And what that's going to do is it's going to speed up from the beginning quite gradually until that keyframe there, and then it's going to speed up a lot more as it gets towards the finish. Okay, let's hit Command 8 to come out of the Keyframe Editor. So the first thing I'd like to do is add our particles. So I'm going to make a new group, Command Shift N, and let's call this Particles. And I'm going to come to the library, and I'm going to select Particle Emitters, Pyro, and I'm going to look for Blurry Sparks, and I'll drag it into that Particles group. Let's hit F4 to come to the controls for Blurry Sparks. So the first thing I want to do is turn on the 3D option, and that allows me to change the shape to box, and this will give us our 3D depth to our particles. And then I'm going to twirl open the size. So I'm going to set a width of 1920 and a height of 1080, and the depth is going to be 1800 because that's the really important factor, so really nice deep depth. And then up here I'm going to select random fill for the arrangement. Let's come down and set the birth rate to 0 and the birth randomness also to 0. The initial number is going to be 1750. And the life is going to be 10. Let's set a speed of 10 and a randomness of 30. We don't really want much speed at all. Then let's finally come down and set a scale of 100 and a scale randomness of 10. And then we'll twirl open the color over life, and I just like to make some changes to these colors. So this second from the left here, click on the color swatch, click on the color wheel, and let's make that a blue like that. And then holding down the Alt key, I'm going to drag that over till it sits in between this one and the end one. Let's twirl open the Blurry Sparks emitter and the particle cell, and let's kill these scale over life and gravity behaviors. Delete those. Then let's come to Blurry Sparks itself and hit F1 to come to its transform. And you'll notice that it's got a Y and a Z value that are not 0. And why is that? Well, an important thing to know about motion is that once you've set up a camera and moved it, any subsequent layer that you create is going to inherit the position of the camera. So in this case, we want to zero out the Y value. The Z value we want to set to 8000. And now if we press play, we're getting our particles flying in. Let's change the blend mode of the particles to linear dodge. And that's going to make them sit in much better. And then we just want to make sure they fade out at the appropriate time. So we don't really want to see them appearing much beyond this point here. So that's 3:15. So let's hit O on the keyboard. And let's hit Command 2 for the library, come to behaviors, basic motion. Let's add a fade in, fade out to the Blurry Sparks. F2 for the inspector, fade in time of 0. Let's add a fade out time of 12. And then they're just going to fade out just as we get to that point there. So I'm not very happy with the fact that the color is all the same. That's not really what I wanted. So I'm going to come back to the emitter, and instead of a life of 10, I'm going to set that back down to 0. I'm going to set the life randomness to 10, and that is going to give me a lot more variation in those colors. And I might also come down here to the color repetitions and set that to 1. So let's just have a quick preview of what that's going to look like when we turn on motion blur. So that's Alt M to turn motion blur on, and you'll see that those streak very nicely. We're going to adjust the look of that motion blur later on, but let me now turn it off, Alt M, and let's move on to some of the other elements. First of all, let's close up particles, and let's make a new group above that, Command Shift N, and I'll call this clouds. And I'll come to the library, generators, and we'll select clouds and bring it into that group. So the first thing I want to do is hit F4 to come to its controls, and I want to change this gradient here. So I'm going to click on the top bar to set a new opacity tab, drag it all the way to the right, click on the left opacity tab and set that down to 0. Then I'm going to click on the right hand color swatch, that's along the bottom bar there, and click on the swatch there and adjust that color, and I really want it to be pretty dark, so I'm going to come down to around there. Let's close that on up. So we just want to make a mask for this so it cleans up the edges. So I'm going to hit Alt R. I'm going to drag a rectangular mask like that. I'm going to come over to the mask controls, and I'm going to set a roundness of 450, and I'll come down to the feather and set that to be -475. So now we've got this much more faded off look that we can use much more satisfactorily. The next thing I want to do is select the clouds, hit F1, and let's look at its position. So it's inherited the camera position again, so let's just set that Z position to be -2000, which is what we want, and the Z rotation to be 0. So we want a larger version of this, so I'm going to increase that scale to 550 so it fills the screen. You'll see that there is a problem with the way the clouds generator works. It's just not nearly as subtle as it really needs to be. So we tend to get these really nasty, blocky artifacts when you start to try and change the colour. Please complain to Apple and ask them to make the clouds generator better, because it's just not good enough. Anyway, Command 2 for the library, filters, blur. We're going to have to use a Gaussian blur to try and sort that out, so bring that in there and hit F3 for the controls, and we'll just have to increase the blur till it sorts that out, so around 30 is probably enough. It's a shame because we've lost detail in the process, but we can't be doing with those nasty blocks. Okay, so next we want to duplicate this, so I'm going to select it and hit Command D, and this version I want to be red, so I'm going to click on that color tab, click on the swatch, and let's bring it over, and again let's make that quite a bit darker, somewhere in there, and F1 for its controls. Let's set a Z position of -1750, and let's set the blend mode to screen and reduce that down to 20%. Then we'll also introduce some Z rotation of 180 degrees, so it flips it round and we don't get the same shape duplicating itself. And I think we'll also increase the scale this time to 600. So this is our base layer of clouds. What we need to do is introduce some extra clouds that we can pass through that'll give us a feeling of parallax and that we're flying through a space. So I'm going to take my base layer of clouds, the blue one, and duplicate it, Command D, and then I'm going to move it to the top of the stack by hitting Shift Command backward square bracket, and I'm going to hit F1 for its position. Set the X position to 500 and the Z position to -500, and what we'll do is we'll come down and reset the scale to 100, and we also want to set the blend mode to screen and the opacity down to 50%. And if I toggle that one on and off, you can see we've now got that cloud shape at the back here. Let's duplicate it again, Command D, and again let's hit F1. This time let's set an X position of 250 and a Z position of -2500. In this case, let's increase the opacity a bit. Now let's duplicate that again, Command D, and again hit F1. This new version will have an X position of -500 and a Y position of -500. And let's reduce the opacity down to 80% again. And let's duplicate it again, Command D, and again hit F1. Let's have a X position of 500, a Y position of 0, and a Z position of 1500. And so now we've got some much more interesting cloud detail as we're flying through. What I want to add is a little bit of red into there as well. So let me duplicate this last one again, so Command D, and let's come over to the clouds gradient here and click on that right tab, and let's set that color to be a nice dark red again. And then we'll hit F1 to come to its controls. Let's set a X position of -400, a Y position of 200, a Z position of 2500. And let's reduce the opacity down to 50%. And then let's duplicate it again, and again let's hit F1. We're going to have an X position of 400, a Y position of -300, and a Z position of 5000. And so that's given us a lot more visual interest and added that nice splash of red in there. Okay, so that's already starting to build up an environment that's definitely got a lot more parallax, a lot more interest. So you've probably gathered by now that I was hopelessly optimistic in thinking that we could finish this off within part 2. There's a a whole lot more that we need to do. So it's probably a good idea to take a break here and come back in part 3 and finish everything off. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again for the final instalment.